So cross-stitch fabric count can be a little bit confusing, to say the least. 14 count, 32 count, what does it all mean? And why do you even need to know? And if you think you know everything there is to know about fabric count, then here's a little conundrum for you. When is 16 count not 16 count? Hi there, Stitchy friends. I'm Kat from Catkin and Lily, bringing you the best tips, tricks and tutorials so you can get the most joy from your cross-stitching. So today I am talking all things fabric count. I'll explain exactly what it is and why it's so super useful to know. And of course, I'll be answering that question of when is 16 count not 16 count. But before I answer that little conundrum, let's talk about the basics. So what do I mean by fabric count? Well, very simply, it's the number of stitches per inch. So how many crosses can you stitch in a straight line in an inch? Now for Aida, the most common counts of fabric are 14, 16 and 18 count, although there are some bigger and smaller than this as well. So for 14 count Aida, I've stitched a row of 14 crosses, and if we measure, you'll see that that's an inch long. This one is on 16 count. I've stitched 16 crosses, and that's an inch. And then for 18 count, I've stitched 18 crosses, and that's an inch long. Now for even weave or linen, the count is usually much higher. The most common ones being 28 or 32 count, but again there are other counts available. Now this is because this is a piece of even weave and the threads are much closer together. So this is 32 count even weave. So if you stitched over just one thread, then you'd fit 32 stitches into an inch. And that's actually what I've done here. That's 32 tiny cross stitches. I can't recommend stitching that, to be honest. It will make you go cross-eyed. So that's why usually on linen or even weave, you would make each cross stitch over 2 threads, which is what I've done here. So on this 32 count even weave, I've stitched 16 crosses. And again, if we measure, that's 16 crosses in an inch over 2 threads versus the 32 when you go over 1 thread. And that makes this 32 count even weave basically the same as the 16 count Aida. Now, if you want to know more about the different types of fabric, then you might find my video on this helpful. So I'll link that in a card up there for you and in the description. Now, if you have a piece of fabric and you're not sure what the count is, then you can place a ruler on it and either pop a pin in here and at 1 inch and count between, or you can just count along. So from here, I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So this fabric is 14 count. Now, one thing I often hear is the count referred to as HPI, or holes per inch. But this isn't actually strictly accurate, because there's always one more hole than there are stitches in an inch. So for this 14 count Aida, I've actually got 15 holes if you count the first one and the last one, but of course only 14 stitches. Now this is of course very much splitting hairs, but I'm kind of pedantic like that and I just thought I'd mention it for information. So now you know what fabric count is, but why is it important for your cross-stitch projects? Well, the most obvious reason is that knowing the count of fabric you're using for a project will tell you how big your completed design will be, and therefore what size piece of fabric you need. Most patterns will tell you how big the completed design is, but they may only give this in number of stitches, or they may not tell you what it is in the specific fabric count that you want to use, so it can be handy to work it out yourself. And yes, there are online calculators you can use for this if you have an allergy to maths, but I quite like to be able to do it myself if I want to. Now, one tip I have for when you're calculating pattern sizes is to always keep in mind a bit of a sense check. So the lower the count is, the bigger you expect your stitches to be, and therefore you'll expect the finished design to be bigger. So if you stitch on 16 count, you'll have a smaller finished piece than if you used 14 count. And if you went down to 18 count, the finished piece would be even smaller. Now, if you keep this in mind, you'll easily be able to spot if you've potentially made a mistake in your calculations, because it can happen. I would say that the majority of patterns will tell you the finished size that they're going to be in stitches, and usually in centimetres or inches for at least one fabric size, and hopefully multiple sizes. Now, that makes it really easy because you can just read off the information that you need from the pattern. So here's the front cover from one of my designs, and you can see all the information you need on here. So you can see the stitch count, and then the design size for the most common fabric counts. So obviously it doesn't cover everything, but it does cover those 3 counts of Aida and the 2 counts of even weave and linen that I mentioned earlier. Okay, let's do a little bit of maths. Don't run away. Because say your pattern only gives you the stitch count like this. Well, you can work out the finished size that it will be by dividing the number of stitches by the fabric count that you're going to use. So if we want to stitch this pattern on 14 count Aida, then we would take the 67 and divide that by 14. And that will give you 4.8 inches. And then if you want to, you can convert that. So that's 12.2 centimetres. And you can do the same with the 74. Divide that by 14. And that will give you 5.3 inches. And if we convert that to centimetres, it's 13.4 centimetres. And if we check, yep, that matches what my pattern says it would be on 14 count Aida, or of course 28 count even weave or linen, because those would be the same size. Okay, so now what if your pattern didn't tell you the stitch count and it's only given you the size in 1 count of Aida? So it's told you 14 count, but you want to stitch it on 16 count. So obviously, again, first of all, we would need to be converting this into inches, but we've basically done that here. So we've got our size on 14 count in inches. And then we're going to multiply that by the count of the fabric that it's told you and divide by the count of the fabric that you want to use. So we'll take our 4.8 inches and we're going to multiply it by the count that it's in, which is 14, and then divide that by the count that we want to use, which is 16. And that will give us 4.2 inches. And if you want to put that back to centimetres, 10.7 centimetres. And again with the 5.3 times 14, which is what it's given in, and 16 to divide by the count that we want to use, and that gives 4.6 inches, which is 11.7 centimetres. And you can immediately, this is where that sense check comes in, because you can immediately see that this is smaller than the 14 count. And we know that's right. We know if we're going from 14 to 16 count, we'd expect it to come out smaller. So that's perfect. And if we look at this one, the sizes are just about, I've got 10.7 centimetres, my pattern says 10.6. Now that's because when you're rounding back and forth between inches and centimetres, it's going to get a little bit different, but that really doesn't make a huge amount of difference. So I hope this shows you how understanding fabric count can help if you want to use a different fabric to the one used in the original project, if you want your finished design to be bigger or smaller than the original, or to help you choose what fabric count to use to make sure your design fits into a specific hoop or frame when it's finished. So for example, for this sheep, if you really wanted this design to fit into a 5-inch embroidery hoop, well, that's 12.7 centimetres. And you can see if you stitched it on 14 count, it wouldn't fit. So you'd have to use 16 or 18 count to make sure it fitted in that hoop. Or you're going to have to use a bigger hoop if you're going to use 14 count. Now, one other reason that knowing the fabric count can be helpful is that you might like to choose your needle size to match the count of the fabric. Now, I've talked more about this in my video on choosing the perfect needle, so go and take a look at that to find out more. I'll link that one in a card and in the description for you. In a nutshell though, higher count fabrics usually have smaller holes, so using an appropriate size needle can avoid stretching the holes, because if the holes get stretched, the finished piece might just not look quite as nice. Okay, so now it's on to that question I posed at the start. When is 16 count not 16 count? Well, there are two situations here, and the first is if you have hand-dyed fabric, because the dyeing process can shrink the original fabric slightly, so the count may be a teeny little bit different, or maybe quite a bit different. So I've got two pieces here. I've got some 32 count evenweave and some 16 count Aida. Now I've popped two pins in here so that you can see. I'll try and measure this 1 inch across, and you can see this one 1 inch is slightly longer than the 32 count. It's about a 33 count, so that's actually pretty close. Now the Aida over here, that's 16 count, this one you can see my pins are really quite a lot closer together than 1 inch. I actually counted this one and it's about 17.5 count. So this 16 count Aida is actually closer to an 18 count than it is to 16 count. Now I'm fine with that, but obviously if you don't like the higher counts to stitch on because you find it more difficult, then it's just something to be aware of. Now the second situation of when 16 count isn't 16 count is with your regular fabric, and it's almost always not exactly the count that it says. It's probably just really hard to manufacture it to be absolutely perfect every single time. So you're almost always going to find that your fabric is just a tiny bit different than the stated count, either in one direction or in both. Now, I found this out the hard way, and I'm going to tell you the story in the hope that it will prevent you having the same issue. Now, this was before I dived down this rabbit hole of fabric count. I started stitching a sampler piece on a piece of DMC 16 count Aida. Now the design was square and also had lots of little square boxes on it as well. And I was stitching away on it and I thought the squares didn't look properly square, but I thought, well, my eyes must just be playing tricks on me because I've stitched the specified 11 by 11 stitches square, but it just didn't look right. So I measured the squares and they were not quite square. In fact, if I measured 5 squares across in one direction, it was 9 centimetres, and then I measured the 5 in the other direction and it was 9.5 centimetres. So across those 5 squares, it was 0.5 centimetre difference in one direction compared to the other. So the whole sampler would have been very much not square by the time I finished it. So whilst it might not matter for some patterns, it was going to be really wrong for this particular one. So I actually abandoned that piece and I started it again on Zweigart fabric, which I've always found to be pretty consistent in terms of fabric count. Although again, it's not perfect, as I'm going to show you. So that was what started me down this rabbit hole of measuring fabric counts. And I have measured lots of fabric and found the stitch count is very rarely exactly to the inch. And I'll show you because these pieces, as I say, these were all stitched. I've got 14, 16, 18 count and the 32 count. So if I put these all on top of each other, these should all be 1 inch. And they should all be the same as each other. Well, those aren't the same for a start. If I put this one on top, that's not quite the same. So these should, I've got 14 stitches on 14 count, 16 stitches on 16 count, and it's quite a bit shorter. And I've got 18 stitches on 18 count, and it's quite similar to the 16. It is a shade longer. And actually, if I put the ruler back on here, you'll see actually that 18 and 16 is not too bad. That 14 count, those 14 stitches are actually a fair bit over the inch. And let's try and bring the 32 count in as well. And it's quite hard to get it lined up. That's actually pretty close. So they're all pretty close to the exact stitch count, but not exactly. And following on from this, I've also found that my completed cross-stitch pieces are very rarely the exact size when finished as stated on the design, because these are worked out to exactly what you'd expect in number of stitches per inch. And if the fabric is slightly different, then your finished piece is going to come out slightly different. So on here, it states on 16 count, I'd have 10.6 by 11.7 centimetres. I've measured this stitched one and it's 10.2 by 11.3 centimetres. So just a little bit smaller than stated. Obviously, this is not going to make a huge difference, but it's just something that's useful to know. And for a small design, any differences will be so small that it really wouldn't be a problem. But if you were stitching something much larger, you might find that by the end of it, the design is as much as half an inch or 1 centimetre different than what you actually thought it was going to be. So in reality, if the count of the fabric you're using is a teeny bit different to what is stated, then it's pretty unlikely to make a difference, unless you have very tight margins on fitting something into a specific hoop or frame. But if you ever end up with your finished project just a little bigger or smaller than you thought it would be, at least you'll know why. And if you're buying a fabric brand that you haven't used before, or perhaps if you're stitching something where, like the sampler I was doing, the squareness of it is particularly important, then I would just measure the fabric that you're using, measure that fabric count in both directions before you start, just to check. I hope that's covered everything you ever wanted to know about fabric count, and possibly some things that you didn't know you needed or wanted to know about fabric count. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please pop them below for me. I do love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching, and happy stitching.